Kidnapped before breakfast, Mara smiled at the four strangers in mismatched armor and said you should have checked the baby monitor in my kitchen because when it goes quiet very loud things follow. They shoved her into the cargo bay of the Black Maw with all the grace of a broken elevator. The bay smelled like hot metal and old spices, the kind of scent that said the crew lived on noodles and fear. Vex, their captain, towered at the hatch and tried to look menacing, which was difficult while a strip of adhesive tape clung to his boot like a needy pet. Zoe, the pilot, bounced on his heels and narrated the whole abduction as if an invisible crowd demanded commentary. Lyra, the engineer, held a tablet covered in hairline cracks. Korga, the silent giant, lifted Mara like she was laundry he did not want to fold. I am not who you think I am, she said, when they finally sat her on a crate marked with a warning about fragile contents that had obviously been ignored. The crate sighed. I am a mother from Hollow Bend. I teach children to plant beans. I do not even own fancy shoes. Vex squinted and consulted the cracked tablet. The file says you are the estranged partner of Governor Stanek. High value. Soft target. No security detail. Lyra tilted the tablet. Or, and this is a stretch, Zoe typoed the name while eating soup. Zoe raised both hands. In my defense, that soup was unusually alphabetic. Also, our intel assets are amateurs who get paid in fuel coupons. Mara waited for someone to tie her hands. No one did. Korga set the rope on the floor with a look that said he did not know any knots. She had taught knots to 7-year-olds last month. She folded her hands in her lap instead and remembered how her son liked to nap with his foot on her arm, the weight tiny but firm, as if he believed she might float away. You have the wrong woman, she said, calm as weather. You should fly me home. Vex leaned closer. He had the face of a man who practiced scowls and reflective surfaces and still could not hold one for long. You think telling jokes will help? No, Mara said. I think not listening to me will hurt. Zoe whistled a tune that sounded like impatience. We will put you in a quiet room until the governor calls back. If he denies you, we sell you to someone who collects curiosities. Either way, we eat. Lyra rolled her eyes. You have the warmth of a malfunctioning fridge, Zoe. Mara looked up at the ceiling and tried to imagine the sky beyond the hull. She pictured Hollow Bend spread under morning light. She saw her son, Rian, cross-legged on the floor with cereal smeared across his face like war paint. Her throat wanted to tighten. She did not let it. She thought of what she always told her students when they faced a problem with too many sharp corners. Breathe first. Name what is real. If I am not home by sundown, Mara said, something that does not use doors will come in anyway. Korga frowned as if he understood doors just fine but had never considered the alternative. Lyra paused mid-complaint. Even Vex hesitated, a twitch across his mouth that might have been doubt. Zoe laughed to fill the quiet. We would welcome the entertainment. The Maw could use ghosts. The cargo will feel less lonely. The ship shuddered as the engines ramped up. Gravity grabbed them and the ground fell away. Through a narrow porthole Mara saw the colony shrink to a cluster of glints, then to a dot, then to memory. The ache settled in, as steady as a heartbeat. She let it be. Pain was also information. They gave her a corner in the crew lounge, a space that tried to be welcoming with a wilted plant and a couch that had seen things. Korga set a cup of something steaming on the table, glanced at Vex for permission to speak, and then did not wait. It is tea, he said. Lyra says it is good for the nerves. Lyra snapped a connector into a ceiling panel and added without looking up, if you spill it on the power bus, I will vent the person responsible into the void, and I will do it without resentment. Vex paced, chewing the inside of his cheek, scrolling through probabilities on the cracked tablet. The governor had not responded to their anonymous message. The price listed under Mara's photo made his eyes brighter, though the zeros flickered like they were shy. Zoe, drifting past unsocked feet, announced that the Maw flew as if eager to escape its own reputation. Mara sipped the tea. It tasted like the last 5 minutes of a storm. She studied the low ceiling, the tangled wires, the dent in the table where someone had once slammed a pistol. She felt the ship like a tuning fork, a hum in her bones, and thought of Rian at this exact moment climbing on the window ledge to check the sky for a shape he knew better than birds or planes. Her stomach tightened again. She set the cup down carefully. She would be gentle with their things until she did not need to be. Vex finally stopped pacing. You said something would come, he said. What exactly? I do not know the word for them in your language, Mara said. The people who watch the gates between unlikely and inevitable. If they believe I am in danger, they will do what they always do. They will correct. Lyra blinked. That sounds like a threat dressed as poetry. I have very few outfits, Mara said. Sometimes they have to multitask. Zoe clapped, delighted. She is funny. I like her. We should keep her even if she is worthless. Korga scowled at that but said nothing. Vex tapped his knuckles on the table. So we should be afraid of an unlisted faction with a grammar problem. You should be afraid of grief, Mara said, and did not blink when silence fell heavy. You should be afraid of underestimating a child. Lyra's eyes narrowed a fraction, as if she had just glimpsed the shape in fog. Zoe grabbed a pack of dried noodles and shook them like a rattle. Korga hovered by the door with the protective stance of a man who did not yet know who he wanted to protect. The moss slid into deep lanes and the stars came on like a curtain raised. In the cockpit, Zoe hummed and called the ship's sweetheart. In the engine passage, Lyra soothed a sulking reactor with the kind of sarcasm that meant affection. Vex sat across from Mara and tried to negotiate a version of reality where she would behave like a typical captive. Mara countered with patience and the occasional remark about how ransom notes should contain complete sentences. The maw drifted through space with the unsettling hum of a beast chewing on something it could not swallow. In the lounge, the mercenaries pretended not to be unsettled by the strange signals shadowing them, but every glance at the blinking console betrayed nerves. Vex claimed the crew needed discipline, so he called for a meeting, though it looked more like a family dinner where nobody liked each other. Mara sat calmly at the end of the table, her hands folded like a schoolteacher waiting for restless children to finish their noise. Vex slammed his palm against the dented table and announced that fear was weakness. He said a good crew had to laugh in the face of anomalies. The trouble was that no one found him funny. Lyra adjusted the wiring on her tablet without looking up. Zoe tried to whistle, but the sound cracked into something resembling a dying bird. Korga rubbed the back of his neck, his silence louder than their captain's speech. Finally, Mara chuckled, a soft sound that cut through the stale air. The mercenaries all turned toward her at once, as if waiting for a parent to hand out judgment. You are like children playing pirate with wooden swords, she said. You want to sound dangerous, but you are really only dangerous to your furniture. Zoe leaned forward with wide eyes, delighted by her nerve. That is the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about us. I think I love her. Lyra rolled her eyes and muttered that Zoe declared love at least twice a day, once for food and once for people. Korga scratched at the table with a fingernail and said nothing. Vex's jaw tightened, but he did not silence Mara. Something about her calmness kept his anger in check, as if she were an anchor disguised as a hostage. Mara leaned back and began to tell them about her son Rian. She described how he once painted the family goat blue because he wanted a pet sky. She told them about the time he declared a civil war among ants in their garden and tried to negotiate peace treaties with breadcrumbs. Her voice held the steady rhythm of someone who had repeated these stories often, but in the corners of her words lurked something sharper. Each story carried the suggestion that her boy was not simply whimsical but touched by strangeness. The mercenaries laughed, then hesitated, wondering if they had missed the warning hidden in the humor. Lyra frowned after one story about Rian predicting the weather by singing to the wind. She asked if the boy had been tested for neurological anomalies. Mara only smiled. He does not need tests, she said. The world rearranges itself to keep him safe. That is all the proof anyone should require. The words hung in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. Vex barked a laugh, though it sounded forced. He told Mara that her dramatic flair would not help her cause. They were professionals, not spooked villagers. Yet even as he spoke, the ship trembled as though something unseen had brushed against its hull. Zoe froze mid-chew on dried noodles. Lyra stared at her tablet where the repeating signal pulsed again, patterns clean as glass, unnervingly deliberate. Korga whispered that it felt like footsteps outside the walls. Mara sipped from the cup Korga had refilled for her and said calmly, "You should laugh louder. Sometimes laughter hides you from what is listening." The mercenaries shifted uneasily. They did not know whether she was mocking them or offering genuine advice, and the fact that both seemed possible made them restless. Vex declared the discussion over and ordered everyone back to stations. Zoe drifted to the cockpit where he hummed tuneless songs to steady himself. Lyra disappeared into the engine passages, muttering at machines as if sarcasm could keep them loyal. Korga lingered by Mara, watching her with uncertain eyes, then finally left, closing the door gently as though afraid to disturb her thoughts. Mara remained seated, her calm a silent echo against the tension that filled the ship. The next hours were thick with unease. Zoe's whistling grew louder, desperate to fill the silence. Lyra cursed at every bolt she touched as if insult might keep the maw intact. Vex paced with the cracked tablet, scanning reports that contradicted themselves. Korga patrolled the corridors with heavy steps, his hand never far from his weapon, though no enemy had yet appeared. The ship felt like it was waiting for a punchline none of them would enjoy. At dinner, which consisted of a pot of something that might have been stew before it lost the will to live, Mara sat with them again. She stirred her portion and remarked that her son would have called it asteroid soup, then convinced his friends it could grant them gravity powers if they ate enough. Zoe laughed too hard, relief bubbling out of him. Lyra smirked despite herself. Vex glared, insisting they were not here to be entertained. Mara met his glare with serenity, and said sometimes survival depends on finding the story in the dark. Even Korga nodded slightly, though he tried to hide it. Later that night, the signals drew closer. Lyra ran a diagnostic 3 times, convinced her instruments were broken. Zoe swore he saw shapes in the starfield that blinked in and out with impossible rhythm. Vex demanded explanations. None satisfied him. Mara, lying on the couch with her hands behind her head, said softly, "They are moving without moving. That is how they travel." The words made everyone still, like prey caught in moonlight. When the lights flickered again, Mara opened her eyes and looked straight at Vex. "This is your second warning," she said. "Turn around, or you will not have the chance again." Vex wanted to shout, wanted to drag her into the brig, but his throat betrayed him with silence. He saw something in her gaze that looked too much like certainty. The mercenaries exchanged glances, their banter stripped away. Even Zoe could not muster a joke. The maw pressed forward into the void, engines straining as though the ship itself wanted to escape. Behind them, the signals pulsed like a heartbeat they could not outrun. In the lounge, Mara sat very still, her expression almost gentle. She knew what the mercenaries did not yet dare to admit. They were no longer hunters with a prize. They were quarry marked by something that did not need weapons to win. The ship slipped into a patch of space that felt like the pause between a heartbeat and the next, and the pause kept not ending. The lights held steady, yet everything looked dimmer as if color itself had been thinned. Zoe muttered from the cockpit that the stars had rearranged themselves into a neat grid only to smear back into a scatter the moment he blinked. Lyra said the reactor was humming in a key that did not exist. Korga posted himself outside the lounge like a door carved from a mountain. Mara folded her hands and watched the way air seemed thicker, as if the maw had drifted into syrup. The first scream came from the forward comms blister. Nyla was young and careful, the sort who labeled her labels, and the crew trusted her with the quiet tasks. She reported a soft tapping on the blister glass like rain, which would have been a delightful miracle anywhere but space. Then she said she heard her mother calling her name from outside, a voice that belonged to a farmhouse kitchen and the smell of stew. Vex ordered her to step away. Nyla said she already had. The next sound was a breath cut off in the middle. When Korga reached the blister he found the room empty, the straps of her chair still buckled and warm, the viewport clear as a confession. A single strand of hair drifted lazily across the air, shining and unburned, and then it softened into dust that fell in a patient line to the floor. Vex locked the hatch and rounded on Mara because he needed a face to aim at. "What are they doing?" he demanded. If you do not answer, I will end this. Mara held his glare without anger, and told him the truth he least wished to hear. They are not doing. They are undoing the mistake of you taking me. They do not think like hunters and soldiers. They think like midwives and judges. They are aligning the story. The maw shuddered without motion, and every hallway grew 2 doors longer than it used to be. Zoe ran 3 times to the cockpit, and arrived each time back at the lounge. He returned winded and a little wild-eyed, declaring that the ship had become a loop with a sense of humor. Lyra threw him a coil of luminous tape, and told him to mark his path. When he tried, the tape stuck to the wall and rippled as if breathing before sliding off to coil itself obediently in his hand. Nothing wanted to behave like a thing in a world that had rules. Spen, the quartermaster, announced bravely that he would jettison a beacon to mark their trail. He was a bright man whose competence made the place bearable. He strode into cargo and opened the outer locker. The locker opened into something that was not the void, not exactly, but a plane of air that shimmered like noon heat over a road. Spen paused and frowned in the thoughtful way he always did when encountering a problem he had not met yet. He reached with the beacon. The beacon entered the shimmer and did not emerge. Spen laughed in disbelief. The laughter ended as a sharp exhale. The locker door closed on its own with the modest click of a civil conversation ending. When Lyra yanked it open, the locker was full of ordinary tools. Spen was not among them. 2 of his fingerprints remained on the edge as if a child had pressed them in paint. No one spoke for a long 10 seconds. Then Zoe whispered that this was not how attack felt. Vex said attack was attack, and everything else was lies. He snapped an order to put Mara in a cell. Korga positioned himself between Mara and the captain because his instincts did not care about orders. Lyra, who distrusted instincts unless they belonged to engines, surprised herself by agreeing with Korga. She told Vex that if the world itself had decided to scold them, putting the focus of its scolding in a smaller room would not help. Mara took her chance to speak as she would to frightened students. You stole a mother and made a child cry, she said. The people who watched the gates heard that cry as easily as you hear engines start. They do not pilot ships. They do not fire weapons. They convince coincidence to stand where they need it to stand. If you continue as if nothing has changed, they will move more of the furniture. Some of you will be lost in the rearranging. If you change what you are right now, you may keep yourselves. Vex demanded something he could hold. Give me one example of change that is not surrender. Mara counted on her fingers without embarrassment. Cut the engines to idle and let the ship drift. Change your transponder signature to a ferry or a clinic. Open the medbay door and leave it open. Send a message that says this is a vessel carrying a mother home. Put your weapons in a locker and tie a ribbon around the handle. Lyra blinked at that last suggestion. Mara shrugged. Symbol is also a lever. The ship groaned and gravity leaned 40 degrees to starboard. Everyone toppled like poorly stacked books. Water in a bottle rose away from the table in a trembling strand and held there, a clear snake startled by its own existence. The air smelled suddenly like rain on warm stone. Zoe swore once and then again with awe. I can see the math, he said, as if confessing to a crime. Lyra pressed her palm to the deck and said the reactor was singing her a lullaby in perfect thirds. Korga put a hand against the wall and closed his eyes. He saw a dog he had loved as a boy sitting patiently by a river that no longer existed. Vex heard a voice call his name, the voice of someone he had failed to save years ago on a moon with a red horizon. The voice did not accuse. It only asked that he do better this time. Lyra shoved herself to her feet and held out a hand to Vex. We can keep pretending this is a universe where force solves every shape, or we can admit we have been invited to behave. Vex stared at her and then at Mara, at the calm wrapped around her like a weathered coat. He gave a single sharp nod. Zoe idle. Lyra, medbay open. Korga, clear the weapons locker and stand watch over it like a mother goose. Zoe jogged off, steadier now that orders existed. He slid into the cockpit and pulled the engines back until their song became a whisper. The ship heaved an almost imperceptible sigh, and somewhere far away a pattern loosened. Lyra propped the medbay door and turned on every light inside, then placed a mug of tea on the cot because hospitality cost nothing and often mattered. Korga opened the weapons locker and laid sidearms inside with careful hands. He did not tie a ribbon because there were none on a ship like this, but he looped a strip of cloth torn from his sleeve and that felt right enough. Zoe switched the transponder to the profile of a domestic fairy, the kind that hugged gravity wells and ferried children to visit grandparents, with pockets full of peppermint. He announced the change in a voice that pretended casual and did not quite achieve it. The NAV console flashed a message none of them had configured. It said simply that help comes when the shape of the request matches the shape of the answer. Zoe swore softly and then laughed without mockery. He said the universe had better handwriting than he expected. The pressure in the corridors eased in a way that was not pressure and yet lived in bones. The grid of stars beyond the forward view softened until it resembled an ordinary sky. Lyra reported that the reactor lullaby had changed to something even sweeter. Vex sagged a little, as if he had been bracing against the wind that finally agreed to go around him. Mara let herself take a deeper breath than any she had since leaving Hollow Bend. The maw turned toward Hollow Bend with all the reluctance of a bully told to apologize. Zoe plotted a course that hugged safe corridors and announced that the ship handled like a stubborn mule with a good heart. Lyra watched readouts that behaved like polite children at a funeral. Korga stood by the weapons locker as if guarding a sleeping animal. Vex prowled the periphery like a storm that had decided to learn manners only to remember it hated the lesson. Mara sat in the lounge and let the ship's new gentleness sink into her bones, a tidal shift she felt as surely as breath. She was still the captive on paper, but the room had adjusted to her as if the furniture had leaned to hear her better. The first sign that the pursuers had decided to speak rather than simply correct came as a bloom of light in the forward view, a soft flower opening in slow motion. Zoe whispered that no known drive did that. Lyra crossed her arms as if folding herself could hide a shiver. The flower became a figure that was not a figure, a design more than a body, a person outlined by moving geometry. The voice followed, the same gentle authority they had heard before, now warm enough to hold. Return her, and no one else will be folded away. Vex bristled at the phrasing and said they were already turning back. The geometry made a rippling motion that might have been a nod. The mercenary vessel has changed its story. This is acceptable. Clarify intent. Mara stood before anyone could move and spoke with the clear tone of someone calling order to a room of overtired students. We intend to return me to my child before sundown there. We will not make a profit. We will not pretend we meant well. We will not lie to ourselves in order to sleep. We will go home and you will let them go home after. The geometric figure flickered gently and the toy piano melody from earlier returned, now richer, threaded with harmonies as if an invisible chorus had joined. The guardians did not seem quite like soldiers then. They seemed like a choir that had practiced long. Vex tried to insert himself between Mara and the light because he needed to reclaim the front of his own ship. He explained that the mall was a business with losses to cover. He proposed that a small compensation would honor their cooperation. Lyra muttered that this was not a market stall. Zoe coughed the word dignity and pretended he had said nothing. The shape of the envoy steadied and a second voice joined, older and quieter. The treaty holds. No one profits from the fear of a child with gifts. The phrase landed in the room with the weight of custom. Korga tilted his head, understanding dawning slow and deep, and asked if they had broken a law older than stars. The envoy replied that they had broken a promise older than law. Mara let that sit and then lifted her hand slightly, a small request for attention that carried perfectly. She addressed Vex in that same teacher voice, the kind that offered a way out without letting anyone pretend it was an escape. There are ways to walk out with your skin and your soul, she said. Say you made a mistake. Say you see it. Say you will carry me home. In return you ask permission to pass, and you promise 3 things. No harm to children. No taking of mothers. No profit from fear. Lyra eyed Vex and said those seemed like 3 rules that would make them less poor in the long run. Zoe added that fear had been their least reliable currency anyway. Korga nodded solemn approval as if stamping a document with a very large thumb. Vex braced himself on the back of a chair and measured the room. He could feel controls sliding away like a plate on a tilted table. He hated the feeling, and yet he sensed the alternative was to be folded into some tidy corner of the universe and forgotten. Before he could answer, the envoy turned toward Mara with an attention so focused the air grew cool. "You speak as one of our own would speak," the voice said. "Why?" Mara exhaled as if finally allowed to say something she had been holding behind her teeth. "Because my son is yours to guard, and because I am kin by old blood. My grandmother could ask the weather to wait. I ask less cleanly. My boy asks without asking at all. He inherited that from me." The ship seemed to lean in at the admission. Zoe pressed both hands to the console as if it might sway. Lyra blinked and grinned despite herself because the pieces fit, and she liked it when systems revealed their logic. Korga smiled like a man who had just been told his childhood stories were not foolishness but maps. Vex stared at Mara with a fresh calculation that shone through his fear. He saw value again, and that glint scared Lyra more than any flicker on a screen. Mara saw it too. She turned to him with a mildness that had unblinking steel under it. "Do not try to sell a tide," she said. "It will drown you for the trouble." To prove her point, she held out her hand. A coin slid across the table, though no one had set it loose. The coin had been lost under the couch for months, a trinket Zoe used for deciding who washed cups. Mara flipped it without touching it, and the air made the smallest bell sound. It hung half a heartbeat too long in the turn, then fell exactly between Vex's open hands and stood on its edge. Zoe whispered that nothing ever did that. Mara smiled a little, tired and fond. "Things like to help if you ask them kindly and mean it. It is not power as you think of power. It is hospitality." The maw followed the glowing path laid by the guardians, its engines purring like a creature relieved it had been spared punishment. For the first time in days the ship felt calm, almost civilized, but calm never lingered long among mercenaries. Tension had simply shifted shape, coiled in new corners, waiting for a chance to strike. Vex sat in the captain's chair with his jaw tight, pretending he accepted the role of humbled guest. Lyra busied herself with diagnostics she had already completed, her hands moving with restless energy. Zoe hummed too loudly in the cockpit, a man desperate to drown out the silence. Korga patrolled the lounge with his quiet gravity, the new mark glowing faintly against his shoulder. Mara sipped her tea and observed them as though watching children playing dangerously close to the edge of a cliff. The fracture began small. Vex caught his reflection in a viewport, and saw not a survivor but a man who had bargained away his pride. That reflection needled him, and when Mara caught his eye and nodded in quiet acknowledgement, he felt her calm as an accusation. He excused himself and stalked toward his cabin, but instead of retreating, he activated the secure channel hidden in the arm of his chair. He called into the void, hoping the Guardian's presence would not jam the signal. His message was simple, delivered with the slick cadence of a man who knew how to sell. "We have captured someone with connections to power beyond reckoning. Make an offer and I will trade her." He expected silence. Instead, the line hummed with an eager response. A rival syndicate answered, voices dripping greed, promising protection, fortune, and a place among kings if he betrayed his crew. Zoe, fiddling with the comm logs out of boredom, caught a flicker of the signal. At first he thought it was an echo of the Guardians. When he traced it further, his eyes widened and his humming stopped. He rushed to Lyra, waving his hands like a conductor. "Vex is calling outsiders," he whispered, his voice sharp with glee and fear. Lyra stared at him, then at the console, then back at Zoe. She swore under her breath. Korga entered just as the words left her mouth, his posture changing instantly into the stance of a man ready to block a door. The three exchanged looks heavy with the realization that their captain had just endangered them all again. Mara did not look surprised when they told her. She only set her cup down with deliberate care. "He still believes fortune will let him keep control," she said. "He has not yet understood that fortune is a river, not a coin." Zoe laughed nervously, insisting that metaphors would not stop Vex from handing them to the wolves. Lyra rubbed her forehead, muttering about loyalty and stupidity being siblings. Korga asked simply what Mara wanted them to do. Her answer was quiet but firm. Let him finish tying the noose, then take the rope away. He will reveal his hunger, and when he does, he will no longer be the captain. The rival syndicate arrived faster than expected, their ships slicing out of subspace like a blade. They hailed the Maw with oily charm, addressing Vex as a partner, promising wealth beyond imagination. The Guardians remained distant, their light steady but silent, as if waiting to see which story the crew would choose. Vex gathered them all in the lounge under the pretense of a negotiation. He explained with false cheer that salvation had arrived, that the syndicate would take Mara safely, that the Maw would be rewarded with riches and safety. His words twisted truth into something that almost sounded reasonable. Zoe shifted uneasily. Lyra folded her arms and glared. Korga's shoulders rose like cliffs. Mara simply watched, her gaze calm and heavy. Zoe broke first, blurting that Vex was selling them to the very predators they had once fled. Vex snarled, trying to silence him, but Lyra stepped forward. She accused Vex openly, her voice ringing with frustration. She told him he had already doomed them once, and now he was trying to do it again. Korga moved between Vex and Mara instinctively, his massive frame declaring his loyalty without words. The crew divided in that instant, the room filled with sharp breaths and louder silence. Vex drew his weapon, not because he meant to fire, but because he needed to remind them he could. Mara's eyes settled on the weapon, then on him, her calm expression unbroken. Do you know what happens when you threaten a mother in the presence of guardians? She asked. Vex hesitated, his hand trembling on the grip. The ship groaned violently, lights flickering, as if the guardians had finally lost patience. The rival syndicate demanded immediate delivery of the prize. Vex shouted back that he controlled the terms. The Maw shuddered again, this time with force that knocked everyone off their feet. Lyra shouted that the reactor was fluctuating as though choosing sides. Zoe cowered but kept recording the scene with a hidden console, muttering that history should at least have witnesses. Korga lifted Vex bodily and pinned him against the bulkhead, fury trembling in his huge arms. The captain struggled, shouted about loyalty, but his crew no longer saw a leader. They saw a gambler willing to sell their lives for a hand of cards he had already lost. Mara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. Enough, she said, not loudly but with a weight that settled every heart in the room. She turned to the console and spoke not to the syndicate but to the guardians who lingered in their silent watch. This is the choice you wanted to witness. A captain has betrayed his promise. His crew has resisted. If you judge us, judge what we do now. The guardians responded not with words but with light, filling the viewports with patterns that danced like constellations rewriting themselves. The rival syndicate ship froze mid-approach, caught in the lattice, engine snarling but going nowhere. The guardians had chosen sides. The Maw glided along the guardians' path, its hull steady now, its engines whispering instead of growling. The chaos of betrayal had left the crew raw, quieter than they had ever been. Zoe no longer hummed, Lyra no longer muttered, and even Korga's heavy footfalls were subdued. Vex sat apart, slouched in a chair near the viewport, eyes fixed on the streak of stars. His pride had drained from him, leaving only a brittle husk of defiance. Mara watched them all with the patience of someone who had endured long nights with sick children, knowing storms often broke before dawn. The Guardian's light escorted them like a constellation that had decided to move. The ship's sensors registered nothing hostile, only patterns so precise they felt like mathematics humming lullabies. Zoe whispered that he almost wished they would keep them all forever, guide them through every peril until the end of time. Lyra shot him a sharp look and told him not to tempt fate, but her voice lacked venom. Korga stayed near Mara, his broad shadow making a shield no one asked for but everyone accepted. For once the crew felt less like predators circling prey and more like weary travelers being shepherded home. Hollow Bend appeared ahead, the green and gold planet spinning beneath a thin veil of cloud. Mara's breath caught, her body leaning forward as if her heart had tethered itself to the soil she could not yet touch. The Maw descended slowly, cautiously, like a thief trying to disguise itself as a guest. The Guardian's light remained with them until atmosphere caught the hull, then flickered and dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only the faint echo of a toy piano note. The sudden absence of that watchful presence made the ship feel strangely heavier. Zoe muttered that it was like losing a safety net. Mara reminded him softly that nets were not meant to last forever. People must learn to walk without them. They landed on the colony's outskirts, where fields rolled in quiet waves and homesteads glimmered with small lights. Mara rose before anyone could stop her, and walked to the hatch. Korga followed, but she touched his arm and told him gently that this part was hers alone. He hesitated, then bowed his head, stepping back with reluctant grace. The hatch opened, air rushing in warm and familiar, carrying scents of soil, grass, and distant cooking fires. Mara inhaled so deeply it seemed she was trying to drink the world. Her feet touched the ground with a finality that sent a tremor through her body, relief and grief tangled together. A small figure bolted across the field. Rian, hair wild, face streaked with dirt, his legs pumping furiously. He collided with her waist, and clung as though trying to merge into her skin. Mara fell to her knees, holding him with a ferocity that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. She buried her face in his hair, whispering his name over and over until her voice cracked. The boy laughed through tears, telling her he had waited at the window every evening, certain she would come back before sundown. She kissed his cheeks, his forehead, his small trembling hands, as though confirming every piece of him existed and none had been lost. The mercenary stood at the hatch, awkward and silent. Zoe sniffled and pretended it was the dust. Lyra crossed her arms, eyes wet but unsmiling. Korga smiled openly, proud as though he had delivered her himself. Vex remained in the shadows, his expression unreadable, though his knuckles were white where he gripped the railing. Mara turned to them, still holding her son, and addressed them with calm strength. You are alive because mercy was extended. Do not mistake it for weakness. Next time, no guardians will come. The universe is patient only once. Her words struck like nails hammered into wood. Zoe nodded quickly, promising never to kidnap anyone who even looked like a mother again. Lyra muttered that rules carved into skin had better stick. Korga placed a hand over the glowing mark on his shoulder, and swore he would guard the promise as his own oath. Vex said nothing, but the silence around him was heavier than words. The crew filed back into the mall, ready to depart before the colony authorities arrived. They left without fanfare, a battered ship limping toward the horizon of stars. Their names would be whispered in cantinas and dark ports, not for glory but for warning. The story of the mercenaries who stole a mother and returned humbled would ripple through space like a cautionary tale. Children would laugh at the foolishness of men who thought they could outwit the guardians. Veterans would shake their heads at the arrogance. No one would forget. Mara carried Rian home, his arms wrapped tight around her neck, his small voice recounting all the adventures he imagined she had endured. He told her he had fought off dragons with a wooden spoon and convinced the wind not to steal their roof tiles. She laughed, kissed his temple, and whispered that he had done more than he knew. She tucked him into bed that night, and sat beside him until his breathing softened into dreams. For the first time since the Maw had stolen her away, she let her shoulders sag and her guard lower. The weight of guardians, mercenaries, and impossible bargains slid away. What remained was only a mother and her child, together under the roof they had built. But outside, the legend began to grow. Word traveled fast in space, faster than truth could chase it. The Black Maw had taken a woman who was no one, and she had unraveled them with nothing but calm words and unshakable love. They said she had faced down predators and laughed. They said she had spoken with beings older than time and walked away unscathed. They said her child was a storm disguised as a boy. Some whispered with awe, others with fear, but all with respect. Mara of Hollow Bend, the mother who warned, became a name carried on lips like a spell. One evening weeks later, as the sun lowered and painted the sky in amber, Rian sat on the porch plucking at a small toy piano. The notes rose uneven, imperfect, but glowing with intent. Mara listened from the doorway, her heart steady and sure. The world bent gently around the boy's laughter, and the wind that had threatened rain chose to wait until morning. She smiled, knowing the guardians still listened, though unseen, and that their story was not over. It had only found its first ending, a pause before the next verse. The Maw drifted far from Hollow Bend, its crew marked and bound by vows they could never escape. Vex nursed his bitterness like a wound, yet even he knew that the weight on his shoulder was not merely a mark but a mirror. Zoe exaggerated the tale in every port, making himself the hero of a story that did not belong to him. Lyra carved the promises into the ship's walls, a reminder etched into steel. Korga wore the mark with pride, carrying it as if it were armor. They all lived under the shadow of a warning, one they repeated with nervous laughter or solemn truth. Never harm a child. Never take a mother. Never profit from fear. Those who forgot would not be corrected again. They would simply be gone. Back in Hollow Bend, Mara closed her eyes beside her son and whispered her own vow. Whatever came, she would be ready. The universe could test her, but it would never break her. She was a mother, and she had given her warning.